as we are getting back to continuing our next segment of the Beyond Boundaries Conference. I'm pleased to introduce today our special guest, Laura Kupe. Laura is a multilingual attorney, national security professional, strategist, advocate, and diaspora leader with over 10 years of experience in national security and foreign policy. Her roles have included serving at the Department of Defense, the U.S. House of Representatives, the Department of Homeland Security, and the White House. She most recently worked as the senior advisor to Deputy Secretary of Defense, providing strategic counsel on homeland defense, civil-military relations, and during the presidential transition. She was born in Germany to Congolese parents, raised in Luxembourg, and the US. She identifies as an Afro-European American, speaks German, French, and Luxembourgish, and is the co-founder of the Congolese Diaspora Impact Strategies, an initiative promoting entrepreneurship, social impact, and the tech sector in the DRC. Laura's work gives us a unique intersection of diaspora perspective, policy expertise, geopolitical understanding, and ethical concerns around resources, which is exactly what this conversation on critical mineral needs, which is the lenses of the African diaspora. So we're really, really happy to have you here, Laura. And let's get started. If you can give us a snapshot of why currently critical minerals are such a strategic issue globally now, considering the climate change goals, tech industries, and power competition, everything that's going on, as we spoke about already, on US-China. Can you tell us a little bit about why critical minerals right now has been on everybody's lips?
Right. Well, thank you so much for the invitation, Nika. So as we've been speaking about this whole morning, critical minerals have been at the forefront of everything that we need for now and the future. So it comes to thinking through the minerals that power the batteries for electric vehicles, all the way to solar panels, semiconductors, and the very fabrics of things that are needed in our weapon systems. So we need critical minerals from everything from our phones to the very things that I just mentioned. And then it's also happening during a time where they are all coinciding at the same time, especially as the United States, China, and other emerging powers are also trying to essentially, I would say, project their dominance. And so control of those critical minerals are a way of projecting power. And one big reality is that China actually dominates a lot of those supply chains. So from rare earth minerals to critical minerals, depending on who you read, upwards to 80% of control of supply chains. And then the interesting part, especially happening to be right now, is the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, has the reserves of a lot of these critical minerals, cobalt being one of them. So upwards to 70% of cobalt output comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And while there are other countries that have cobalt reserves, say in Australia, the quality of Congolese cobalt is the best. And it's the same for other minerals like copper and uranium. So the interesting thing is, my friend Nee is here, he calls, Congo's like the real Wakanda. So it really has the best quality of those reserves, but then where Congo is not like Wakanda is unfortunately is also one of the poorest countries in the world. So especially being Congolese Americans, seeing that paradox is quite striking.
Absolutely. I mean, it's been a few weeks where you've seen it, and I know you hosted an event just last week. There's a lot of interest in the DRC, but one thing that we haven't figured out is what is going on in terms of the negotiations and everything that leads us up to this moment. Why are we not seeing contracts being signed the way we think that they should be signed? Or could you maybe tell us a little bit about how these negotiations are going between U.S. and DRC in terms of getting these critical minerals for the U.S.?
And I will also just provide you all with some context as well. because some people might not realize that the US and the DRC and Rwanda are talking, but essentially what happened is the president of Congo saw what President Zelensky did when negotiating with the Ukrainians. So President Zelensky proposed a securities for minerals type agreement so that to secure US military support. So Ukraine is also resource rich, and at the beginning of the year, President Zelensky approached the Trump administration to ask for military assistance in exchange for minerals. So many would say that President Tshisekedi of the DRC saw that and used that as a bargaining tool at a time where Eastern Congo also has been experiencing the resurgence of armed groups in northeastern Congo, essentially invading those parts of Congo. And President Tshisekedi, whose regime many would say is in peril, reached out to the Trump administration to get that, get that, especially military support. The Trump administration paid attention to it. I think in general, you will probably not see US boots on the ground, but clearly was interested, especially because of the national security interests that the US does have. So again, for our weapon systems, we need high-grade cobalt and copper. So President Tshisekedi did get President Trump's attention, and the US has played a role in trying to get a peace deal first between the US, Rwanda, to at least, I would say, create a more stable, I would say, picture on the ground. And then I forgot to also clarify that the armed groups that are operating in Eastern Congo, it is documented by organizations like the UN that Rwanda has been supporting them. So that is why the US has also spoken to Rwanda about the instability in Eastern Congo because of that documented relationship. So that deal, the peace deal, was signed in May, and the goal is now to also have an economic/minerals deal talking about economic cooperation between Congo and Rwanda in relation to critical minerals, where, of course, Congo is the source of a lot of those minerals, but Rwanda has processing capacities that, in a best case scenario, would be a win-win situation for both countries, but unfortunately there's been tensions between those countries, especially since the Rwandan genocide. So all that to say, no one really knows what's going on, and I think we're all just trying to, observe what's happening. But I think it speaks to the broader concerns about how these types of agreements should have transparency, also to have different types of people in the room besides government officials. We should have civil society, private sector, other organizations also there, just to kind of learn what is happening. So to make it shorter, because I just also wanted to make sure folks had context. I don't think anybody knows, and I think we just learn what's happening when we see things signed, like we did in May with that initial peace deal. So apparently I heard, and I feel like this sounds like gossip, but that the minerals or the economic portion of the US's role in helping the DRC build its mining capacity should be any moment now, but time will tell.
Well, any moment now, hopefully, because it's important. Could you tell us, or could you dive in a little bit on what both parties are getting wrong? If you can.
Or areas for improvement?
Areas for improvement. Why can't we get these deals signed in a proper manner? Why are we not negotiating? Or at least the way that they should be, it should not be a no-brainer.
Right. Well, I mean, I think one thing, I would say on the DRC side, clearly President Tshisekedi wants to protect his regime and not have his country be invaded by armed groups. So it looks like he reached out to the United States for regime survival, but didn't really think through, if you reach out to the US, like, you should have your house in order. And so on the Congolese side, I wonder if with this outreach they thought about long-term investment versus just short-term, like regime security and getting US companies in, but not thinking, right now, as of right now, I haven't seen a vision for, if you do invite US private sector in, have you created the business climate for that? Are the laws in order? Is your tax policy in order? So you don't really see that. And then also with the DRC, the infrastructure, unfortunately, right now is not there. So if you talk about electricity, the roads, even if you look at the workforce standpoint, in my opinion, they didn't think through that. And then I think the other thing is thinking through ways to leverage this moment through either tech transfers, as has been alluded before, and again, that capacity building in terms of from the workforce development sense. So in my opinion, I don't know if they had all their ducks in a row before reaching out. And I think on the US side, I think it is encouraging to see the United States engage Congo, not just strictly through a traditional, development or aid model, but through a commercial presence, which I think a lot of folks in the Africa space in DC have welcomed, to have that more proactive commercial investment, which the Chinese have had a head start across the continent for almost 30 years now. So from the US standpoint, this administration, of course, with its America First approach, appears to engage in a more transactional or extractive way, and my hope is that they too don't approach this moment just through that extractive lens, but also approaching the DRC or other African countries that are resource rich as true partners, which has also been spoken about earlier today.
Yeah, absolutely. From your experience, how can diaspora communities influence or contribute to a more equitable resource governance, supply chains, and policy in Africa? All right, in your case, DRC, but what are some examples that you already see working already, or that could be scaled?
Yeah, I mean, again, I mentioned that I'm Congolese American, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Congolese Diaspora Impact Summit, which has focused on leveraging, especially the talents of second-gen diaspora in the United States and focusing on millennials and Gen Z. So no disrespect to the aunties and uncles, but we're different. A lot of us were either born or grew up here in the United States, have gone to school here, worked in the U.S. government. I worked in the U.S. government, worked at tech companies, you name it. So in terms of, if you think about second or third generation diaspora, we tend to not say we don't care about the politics of the country of origin, but we're more removed because we grew up here and have been integrated here. And so we recognized that demographic of the diaspora, especially if you look at immigrant diasporas, is different. So the one thing that I would say we do have, especially if you look at things through the African immigrant diaspora lens, is that we have the cultural context, folks have the language skills, but also I think we can be bridge builders. So we know how things work in the United States, and we also have, some semblance, depending on how, early or later folks immigrated to the US, they have a better understanding of what's happening in the DRC. I grew up mainly here, so I know my limitations, but I think everyone has different strengths, and what we focused on with CDIS is we focused on tech, entrepreneurship, and folks who work in social impact, because we realized that our generation, especially as millennials and Gen Z, we are more tech savvy. We're just, again, no disrespect to our parents who are on WhatsApp, but we just move a little different. And so essentially, we wanted to bring together that network because we realized that folks have these superpowers, and it makes sense just to convene. But also CDIS is for anyone who's also interested in Congo, so you don't have to just be Congolese. It's anyone who wants to partner with someone to make an impact, because the opportunities in Congo in particular are endless, but it's also hard. So you're gonna need people who understand the law, who understand, the tech ecosystem, all of that. So essentially that's how CDIS was born. And I think during moments like this, diasporas can be really good advocates about pushing for new innovative policies, because we tend to see the gaps on both sides, or also be advocates on things like the environment, which was alluded to earlier, because mining is very destructive in terms of the toll it takes on the environment, but also on the communities, because there are also health implications. So I think the diasporas can be bridge builders on the business side, but also be a source of, holding both the US government or the Congolese government accountable to adhere to ethical standards, or at least highlight shared values, and then also highlight the opportunities for prosperity and collaboration, and that hopefully whatever comes about isn't just, again, extractive or neo-colonial in nature.
Yeah, as you know, as you mentioned, there's a lot of degradation that comes environmentally from the extraction of critical minerals. And in that vein, with everything that is going on in the region, how can human rights concerns and the environment be integrated in these thoughts as companies are preparing to come to the DRC? And also, how can we integrate those in both private investment and policy frameworks, like making sure that folks are talking and thinking about the environment?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, unfortunately, a lot of the issues you just mentioned are not new, and I kind of also feel like we're seeing a repetition of things, because I'm sure for those of us who are, maybe I'm very much talking like a millennial, but we remember the conflict diamonds era, right? So I kind of feel like we've kind of been there before, and there are actually a number of international frameworks already in place that companies in particular could look to, like the UN has guiding principles, the OECD does, and then some would say it was ill-fated, but on the US side, we had the Dodd-Frank Act, Section 1502, which was a provision to hold US companies accountable and to trace their supply chains to make sure that they weren't getting minerals that were under the control of armed groups. And unfortunately, even though I think folks were well-intentioned in structuring that section of the law, it hasn't had the impact, because again, especially if you look at Eastern DRC, the conflict has been going on for 30 plus years. And so I think for any of us who are interested in, especially peace in Eastern DRC, we need to be more focused on the root causes, which, especially if you look at the conflict piece, that there's accountability for the armed groups that have been engaging in the violence for the past 30 years, which unfortunately seems to not have happened. And then also this peace deal that the US helped broker, there aren't any accountability measures for the armed groups that have been engaging in the violence. And then I think, again, why I'm so invested in the work of CDIS is seeing how at least the diaspora could create businesses or help run schools to at least give some sort of sense of normalcy to folks there, because again, it can be very easy to be hopeless in the circumstances. But I think with any of the agreements that come about, especially if that economic or minerals deal comes about, that in terms of diaspora or any concerned Americans, that any agreement or US companies that do business in the DRC, that we can point to existing frameworks that already exist, especially through multilateral fora. And also our European colleagues also have due diligence laws that we could also point to.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to do due diligence. From your policy background, what are some US or international government policy levers that could help ensure that the critical minerals value is captured fairly, whether it's through trade policies or incentives or regulatory standards? What's your opinion on some policy tools for this type of engagement?
So I'm a fan of using development finance tools. So on the US side, we have the Development Finance Corporation, we have the US Trade Development Agency, we have the Export-Import Bank, because the one thing is where the Chinese have been able to develop an advantage is Chinese private sector firms have the backing of the Chinese government to take on the risk to operate in Africa. US private sector doesn't necessarily have that, and because of that, especially on the Chinese side, that they've had that security, or like the Chinese private sector has had that security, China has been able to be in Africa for the long term versus if you look at US foreign policy, we're kind of like it's just not consistent. And so that is why we need those, especially I think financing tools from the US side to really build that long-term presence. And it also shows to African partners that the US is actually serious, which we, with, depending on, and it makes sense, we have our democracy and the US voters vote one way or another, but it leads to maybe an inconsistent US-Africa foreign policy in the long term.
Yeah.
I'm probably being very diplomatic here.
Thank you for that. We really appreciate you being diplomatic. If you were setting a roadmap for the next 3 to 5 years, what are some top priorities you'd like to see, both from the side of the diaspora in terms of actors and on the government side, just to make critical minerals not a source of growth but also sustainable development? So what are some top priorities that you think you'd like to see?
On the US side, being a US citizen with Congolese roots, I think it would be great to see how, again, those development finance tools could be used to help diaspora businesses, not only in the sense of the mining sector, but I know Congolese American folks that are running farms, thinking through things like logistics, have trucking businesses. So also thinking about and those infrastructure questions, especially with folks that have training in terms of backgrounds of engineers. My father is an automotive engineer, he's about to retire. There's all these folks who are retired that could go back and teach and things of that nature. So I think, especially with US aid not being there anymore, how could the US capture in whatever future iteration of whatever US development policy will be to use those talents, or anyone again, and we also have like former Peace Corps folks. I think there's a lot of energy there, and figuring how can we harness that. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and then also the Ethiopian diaspora has been great at this. They have their own diaspora investment fund, so figuring how there could be repetitions for other diaspora communities that want to fund those long-term projects where you may not see the immediate profit, that immediate return, but with the diaspora in particular, you find that level of patience that maybe hasn't always been there traditionally on the US side. And then I think in general, the other thing, my other hope is that in the long term, we can again advocate for, especially for African countries, to really think about their industrial policy for the long term and not just, again, that short extractive, I would say, time frame, and to help them mature in that. And I think there's a lot of educating for African governments to also understand how the US works, because I think a lot of them have been, and again, I think it's been due to our absence, but they are more familiar with how the Chinese do business. But if you want to engage with the US or you want to come to Washington, you have to understand what Washington wants, needs. You have to sell yourself. You're not just going to get handed things. So there's also education on the African side in this regard, and also recognizing on the African side that US politics changes or quite fast, so you might have to change your approach depending on who's in power. Even if maybe you talk to someone yesterday, they may not be there 4 years from now. So I think on both sides, there needs to be more long-term thinking and less short-term thinking. And I think the diaspora in particular could be those bridge builders. But I also recognize that diasporas can also be disruptive at times. So I don't want to sugarcoat that the diaspora is a solution for everything. But I do think when it comes to very technical sectors, engineering, things of that nature, those topics also don't tend to be as political. And that is also why CDIS has approached its diaspora engagement in that specific way.
And so what does your group do differently in terms of engaging? I'm curious.
Well, maybe it's also just in general my nature and being a lawyer, but I think you can't avoid the politics, but also just focusing on technical expertise, I think is in my opinion, a safe bet. and also recognizing that government also has its limitations, and that's why our network has also leaned on folks that are entrepreneurs, because especially someone who's been a government employee for a long time, I've always just been amazed at how business people are like, well, this didn't work, so I'm gonna pivot to this, you know, versus if you're kind of used to being in bureaucracies like I've been for much of my career, you don't see that pivoting as much, and folks are a lot more creative.
Yeah, well, we had to be creative. We
Right.
were not going to go ahead and talk about AGOA and all these topics that, to me, unfortunately, are kind of dead on arrival.
Yeah.
And so that's why we wanted to expand our minds and kind of take things differently and talk about the
Yeah,
future.
because I've been, like you, I've been in DC for, you know, 10 plus years, and remember, yes, we talked about GOA back in 2014. And also what I appreciate about the CDIS network is also the younger demographic of the diaspora is also more tech savvy and more digital versus, you know, our elders. And I think it's in those types of innovative spaces that I think we can hopefully develop some new solutions.
I think we will. Well, thank you, Laura. We're going to bring in some questions from the audience. Do we have folks? Okay, we have Maurizio in the back. We have Maurizio, and then we have Singozi.
Thank you for the presentation, very interesting. Maurizio Geri from Italy. I am a postdoctoral researcher at George Mason on hybrid warfare with Russia and China and energy sector. And as you know, and Neka know very well, we have the Mattei plan in Italy for Africa. You know, we want to transform it in a European program. So do you think how US and EU could cooperate more in this? Because to win the competition with China, US cannot make it alone, Europe cannot make it alone. We also need Turkey, which is very strong in East Africa. Do you think maybe the good cooperation that we have now between your president, our president, could be used to launch a grand strategy to make this sector the area where we can do the technology transfer, peer-to-peer development, etc., etc.? How can we improve this cooperation? Because I think it's crucial. Thank you.
Well, one thing I actually forgot to add to my long-term hope is I think one big thing is US and Europe in particular could help with value-added processing. So instead of, because right now which is the norm across Africa, is that the minerals are taken out of the ground and then, you know, it's not even processed there. Also, I grew up in Michigan, so I'm an auto industry kid, right? So it'd be great to have like a plant that, you know, processes this. So I think thinking about, you know, keeping it in Africa or in country to help build that, it could be a place where you could win over, I would say, African governments, because again, the Chinese have been very extractive in that way, and then also by focusing on adding to the value-added processing capacities, you keep jobs in country, you could train, but again, that would require, train the local workforce, but again, that would require a long-term commitment, which I think we all recognize needs to be here. So I think that is where the US and Europe could help in particular. I hope that answers your question.
We have one from the Singozi, and then me, and then Selena, and then Ms. Stephanie over there.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Lovely presentation. You really hit the high points of my areas of interest. You talked about what I would call equitable mining. You talked about the environment and the impact. You talked about the community. So and respectfully, all Africa have very high quality minerals. So I think going from your organization and the diaspora here and being Gen Zs, I'm asking the question, is there any way that all the African diasporas can actually join together, act like a think tank, advise the African leaders, because it's been said that Africa's problem are the political leaders. So is there any way that you can form a coalition that could advise the leaders in regards to now that Africa is the young lady that everybody is courting, to negotiate well, to come to a position, negotiate from a position of strength, such that we can still have the equitable mining, we can still have the, mitigate the environmental impact, and we can also have value add within the country and be in a position to actually get a seat on the table in a very strong way. Look at what Ethiopia did. They self-funded that dam. It's doable. We just need to do it ourselves. We shouldn't just always be hands out waiting for somebody to assist. Thank you.
Well, I actually spoke to someone earlier today about how I would love to talk to folks in the Ethiopian diaspora, because they also have their diaspora impact fund, and then also it's been great to see the Ethiopian government being proactive in thinking through its electricity and infrastructure issues. So one thing I think with this moment, it's shown us that there are also some organizations that need to exist that don't exist right now, so it looks like there's opportunities, especially for those of us who are US based, to clearly create some new organizations, new institutions. I think usually it's disruptive moments that bring about the creation of new entities. And I think also, it's also a great opportunity for them to be focused on entrepreneurship and not necessarily in traditional aid models. So one, I think new institutions need to be created. So I guess we need to take notes or seeing if the Texas A&M may be willing to house that. But I also think, especially through a diaspora lens and being Congolese American, we also have the African Union, and the African Union says the diaspora is part of the African Union. So I wonder also if there's leadership with the African Union that could help bring together working groups and seeing how diaspora communities, wherever they are, Europe, America, the Americas, wherever, to help be a brain trust and, of course, make recommendations, but we can't control what African governments do with that. But I think on the US side, I think especially this room is an example of folks that could collaborate in a number of ways. So maybe like an incubator type thing.
That sounds great, and there's too much going on. So I will find some other people who will be interested.
Right, or it's like, are
building
people can fund
another
us,
organization. Selena had a question, and then we'll take it to me.
Thank you, and I know we talked earlier on. So I've spent most of my career on the continent of Africa. I now focus primarily on Nigeria, Angola, and Congo. So my first entry into Congo was in a mine in 2013 on a USAID project, of course, which does not exist right now. And what I was doing was, it was a women's program, and we were trying to stop, women are raped in the mines, and so, the children, they're having these children, so, preventing them from having more children that they can't support, because these are artisanal miners, and so we were doing an IUD program, and we had to take blood and urine samples, and what we concluded out of the blood and urine samples was extremely high levels of radioactive material. So they were mining in and around concessions of uranium, cobalt, and copper. Reported this up into the likes of DITRA and some others, and it all went quiet. And why I mention that story is because I think the United States, especially when it comes to Congo, and I know it's the sexiest topic of the day, I just came from UNGA, all it is critical minerals, critical minerals. The US is relatively new to this discussion. And also we're in a very transactional time frame, and I think, how do we avoid that transactional nature to make it more long term? And to your point, being down at Indaba in Cape Town, the African countries made it quite clear that they're no longer shipping raw material. So the refining capacity has to happen in country, which I think is an opportunity for the United States and other countries. Now this is the last thing I'll say, is that the United States is not a mining country. I don't know why they're so fascinated with mining, and I always say they should focus on what they're really good at: satellite communication, data centers, and Beyonce. I think that those are the values of what we bring to the continent and leave the mining up to the Australians, the Canadians, and the South Africans. But that I think allows for a collaborative environment. And the mining conversation, I would say, and I'd like your thoughts on this, can expand out to build out other opportunities like those data centers, like that you need energy. You know, a whole community can be built up around mining. In Kolwezi alone, the Kamoa mine hires 19,000 young people in Kolwezi alone. So there's opportunities for other industries to occur. Do you think that the US is up for expanding out into those other areas as we talk about critical minerals?
Thank you so much for your questions, Linda. And I'm also a former Hill staffer, so I'm also realizing that everyone in this room could just do, I think we need to do better advocacy as well, to also advocate in front of our members of Congress about other opportunities in Congo or across Africa beyond mining. Of course, it being a key employer for a number of African countries, including Zambia, South Africa, you named a number of them. But I did allude to earlier that there are other opportunities outside of the mining ecosystem or that feed into it. People need to eat, so farming, or people need hotels, and people need trucking and roads. And so I think those are also great opportunities for US companies beyond the mining ecosystem to really think really hard there. There's also a lot of, you know, solar capacity, like solar power. So I think there are a lot of opportunities, but I think in general, our US-Africa policy has lacked imagination. And so I think hopefully with whatever sector you are in, we can push people to look at Africa beyond the way we've looked at it traditionally. And yes, exactly. This is why this is amazing. But I think it's like, let's push ourselves to think broader. And I think that requires an advocacy of sorts. I know some people might think advocacy means activism. No, I think it's, you know, with whatever sector, right, or lobby, but it's also just highlighting those very things, and let's expose ourselves. Like, I think the earlier speaker talked about NASA. NASA did not think through limitations. It thought broadly, and I think, especially if we look right now, we are in a new era of global competition. That is what is required right now. So I think and as someone, again, I'm from Michigan, but I was like, I'd love to, like, GM used to be in Congo, like back in the 70s, right? We dropped the ball too. We did not have long-term thinking. And so I think this is an opportunity to reset and take inventory of where we can do better. But part of it is, I think the hard part is it requires long-term thinking, and people have short-term attention spans. So in my diaspora organizing hat, I just realized that this is worth it to me. I love both America and of course my Congolese heritage, and I'm at least committed to try to have these conversations and build these connections, and that's why we created the Congolese Diaspora Impact Summit. So especially because we are millennials, that we look at entrepreneurship, try to leverage tech to do that, and then hopefully we can find partners wherever they are to make impact wherever we can.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your insight, Laura. This has been great, from geopolitics to ethical considerations and to. Oh, I'm so sorry. Nee reminded me
we
that.
could do a popcorn, Nee's question, and then.
Yeah, I apologize. I was about to close it out, but
No,
Nee.
if you have to close it out.
No. Nee has a question.
I'll make it. Good afternoon. I'll make it real quick.
Excuse me.
I just got back from Brussels, and there is the European Commission, European Parliament, EU has an initiative called Global Gateway, and it's about using development cooperation, but also the private sector and also EU resources to support economic development. My question to you is, and they call this their version of BRI, and it's not perfect, but my question to you is, or I guess I should say, right now it seems that the U.S. has, there is not much coming from the U.S. when it comes to ODA, official development assistance, but there are other strategic partners that are willing to step up to the plate, albeit they're also thinking about their challenges. You know, EU's going through a lot of difficulties, challenges, and as we as Africans, we have to be strategic and smart. EU has this program, they're not doing a really great job to market it, but I think there is an opportunity to connect. My question to you is, what opportunities do you see with other strategic partners besides China and what have you, where we can leverage their assets to provide technical assistance and mentorship to support? I'm also an automobile child, to support tier 1, 2, and 3 manufacturers, right? Not only for automobile, but we're also talking about other things that require critical minerals. That's my question. Thank you.
So, I mean, I think we're already seeing those, I mean, and I'm speaking from a US lens, those middle powers, you already see UAE, Qatar, Turkey, India, like across a number of countries in Africa. And so if I was the Congolese government or any African government, it's like, you do what's best for you and who can provide those gaps. Again, they also have agency and they don't have to work with the United States, China, or Russia. And I think we've seen a lot of instances where they have worked with those emerging powers. So again, from a US standpoint, we also need to recognize that, you know, if we approach any country to partner with us, they have choices. And we've seen evidence of that where African countries have wanted to work with India instead. And also those countries, those emerging powers are trying to build their influence. So again, it showcases, I think, especially those of us who are based in Washington, people have options. And if we want to become the partner of choice, we also need to bring things to the table.
I completely agree with that. We have one question from Ms. Warnke and one over there that's, yeah.
Really quick, thank you. Thank you for organizing this. This is wonderful. I just returned from Japan, by the way, yesterday, and I went to the World Expo. And I'll tell you, Japanese companies are certainly a source that we should look at. They definitely want to invest in Africa, and I've had conversations. But that was I went on behalf of Sister Cities International. We have a huge program and focus right now on Africa. And we just established here in Washington, D.C., the Washington, D.C. Sister Cities International Foundation. And we have 5 sister cities from Africa, which people may not know about. So we would love to collaborate, but certainly commercial diplomacy is at the top of our list. And Nii knows this as well as I do. We would love to be able to collaborate and partner. Texas has a terrific Sister Cities program. But nationally, we as an institution, by the way, we're one of the few surviving organizations at State Department that's going to get funded. So I should have. Thank you. Thank you. But we do good work. But our focus really has been commercial diplomacy. So please, if we can have more conversations offline, I would love to see how we could collaborate. Thank you.
And then one last question so that we can close it in.
Hi, thank you, Laura. As a lawyer, I also have a question that relates to the mineral and the ethics area. You mentioned that one of the things that we could do as lawyers is to hold governments, accountable. But in addition to that, do you see any role for lawyers, especially in terms of drafting agreements during negotiations, where they can provide their expertise for governments? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm not a contract lawyer. I hated contracts in law school, but I'm realizing that I should have enjoyed it more. But in general, any company that wants to do business in Africa will need to, company, government, there will be agreements signed. One thing that I think is interesting too, or is important to keep in mind, is African countries have their own laws. So like Congo has its own mining code. So I think it's even, I would say, figuring out how you can help, especially US companies, interpret those mining codes. I have friends or colleagues or associates who've tried to understand the Congolese mining code, and they're like, whoa, this is intense, and this takes some time, and it's in French. So regardless of whether it's the DRC or an Anglophone or Lusophone country, It's definitely also understanding the laws of the place you're trying to do business and advising US companies about what that takes, you know, and invest accordingly to make sure that you get the right licenses and all of that. So make sure you have your house in order so that especially US companies don't get in trouble doing business there, but also helps them manage expectations and see if they want to take on the risk of operating there. And then I think also on the applicant side, they need to understand US laws, our ethics, you know, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, you know, things of that nature. I think, because I think what I've learned, especially just like you said and others, everyone talking about critical minerals is that, you know, African officials don't realize, like, you can't do what you do back home. Like, you're in America now, right? So even that education and on how to approach US officials or making sure you know, approach government officials properly through the right channels, there's an education on their side as well. We have FARA, you know, things of that nature. So I think there are a lot of opportunities, I think, for lawyers, depending on just thinking through the initial engagement piece to the closing on transactions.
Thank you for that. We're going to close on this fireside chat, but you're welcome to stay because we're going to continue with the critical minerals everywhere else. So we're going to have Ms. Selena Hayes join us, and then John Bosco Nizemana, and Ni Ahela Nuno is also going to join this next panel. And then after that, we'll go ahead and have lunch. So thank you so much, Laura, and I'm going to call everybody else to join us at this moment so that we can go ahead and finish this critical mineral discussion and then have lunch for everyone to just, yeah.
You guys just got here. We're just gonna finish this one and then move for lunch because it makes sense, I feel, to just talk about the critical minerals since we're all here already. So, or do we?
I'm good, whatever you wanna do.
Does that work? Thank you. We're gonna do the panel now because we're still talking about critical minerals. I feel like if we break for lunch now, yeah. Kind of. Yeah. Anyway.
Hi, I'm Jared, I'm moderator. Nice to meet you. Hey, I'm Jared. Nice to meet you. Hi, nice to meet you.
He's from Culture Farm and Cheese Company.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
Oh, yes. So he's
I'm good, how are you?
oh, you guys were on the call. Yes.
Yes.
How you doing?